Experience stuff.
Exactly. Alrighty, welcome today. My name is Colonel Denny Peebles. I'm the Senior Aerospace Science Instructor here at PrescottJROTC, Prescott, Arizona. We're lucky today to have a local Prescott war hero and SR-71 pilot, Colonel Retired Pat Bledsoe. He is talking with us today about two of his subjects. We'll have the first hour regarding his FAC, 01 Vietnam experiences, and the second hour regarding his SR-71 experiences. He basically earned his pilot wings in Texas and was a flight instructor, but then worked his way towards Vietnam and 400 combat mission, 900 combat hours, and an 01 aircraft. Came back to be a fighter pilot, which I love, F-106 instructor pilot, squad weapons officer, and then somehow got into the SR-71 business. We'd love to hear that. And actually, one of the claims to fame, which is pretty unique, is that he set the absolute world record for speed over a closed circuit, 2,092 miles an hour. That's pretty awesome. I know in the F-15E, I once went Mach 2, and it was about 1,000 miles per hour, so I'm half as good as you are there. That's great. After that, he ended up being an intelligence air attaché and retired and became an Alaskan airline pilot. And let's see, total of 15,000 flight hours and 35 different aircrafts and lots of good war medals, including the Silver Star and Distinguished Surviving Cross, 3 Oak League clusters. Quite a war hero, really neat. These guys are bored listening to me talk about flying jets. Just to relate experiences, I flew F-15s. I have 3,000 fighter hours. He has 15,000 with multiple different planes. So it's quite an honor to have him here. Everybody give him a round of applause, please.
Hey, thank you, Denny. First, let me just do a brief introduction about the definition of a forward air controller. Does anybody not know what that is? The idea is that the fighters are going too fast to find their targets hidden in the jungle. So guys in little slow Cessnas would fly around at low altitude at 90 or 100 miles an hour and find the targets for the fighters and then direct them to them. That's, in a nutshell, that's what forward air controllers is.
Do they still use forward air controllers in today's?
As far as I know, the forward air controllers the Air Force is using right now are all on the ground.
Yeah.
I don't think we're using airborne forward air controllers in Afghanistan or places like it. Although in the interim, there were forward air controllers who flew A-10s, for example. They're not using them for that mission anymore, to the best of my knowledge. Okay, please excuse the pun there. We didn't actually fly our laser just quit. Anyway, notice the 2 rocket pods on the wing there, L7 each.
You don't normally see those on Cessnas, I guess.
No, we did not fly them that way. That was meant as a joke by 2 frustrated fighter pilots.
There weren't many offensive weapons on this plane.
Well, we normally carried 1 rocket on each of those pylons there, so it would be a total of 4. Well, we did occasionally fly them with 1 of those LAU-3 7-shot rocket pods on each wing.
Explain to him what you did with the rockets.
Okay, the rockets, instead of having high explosive or armor-piercing warheads, would have white phosphorus warheads, which would make a big puff of brilliant white smoke to mark the target for the fighters.
Okay.
And this is all, guys, before satellites, before GPSs. Today, we have somebody on the ground and says, with a laser designator, here's your GPS target. It's immediately zapped to the fighters, and they drop bombs on that GPS target. In the old days, he had to mark. He had to see the bad guy on the other side of the hill, send a rocket over to him, set up a little rocket smoke, and then directing the fighters relative to that. What's everybody doing to him at the same time? Shooting him, trying to shoot him down and kill him. You better believe it, because he was the reason they got bombed. So it's different technologies now.
Yeah. Okay, just put it in a nutshell. This is what I was briefed on as soon as I arrived in Vietnam. Of course, how we did it is a little bit more complicated. There are some acronyms that are going to come up in the briefing today. PACAF, Pacific Air Force, headquarters in Hawaii. MACV was the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, with headquarters in Saigon. And for the most of the time I was there, General Westmoreland was the commander. You've probably heard that name. ARVN, Army of Republic of Vietnam, that was the South Vietnamese, our allies. And then the PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam, was the North Vietnamese soldiers who were fighting with the Viet Cong in the South. The Viet Cong were the local communist guerrillas. Okay, this is what we were flying in the early days in Vietnam. Cessna 01, well, there were various models. Most of them were 01Es. The only real difference in that and one of the other models was this one had a fixed pitch propeller. The 01F had a constant speed propeller, which would give you maybe 5 knots more airspeed, but there's a lot more maintenance in the field, so the Air Force preferred the 01E. It weighed about 1,500 pounds empty, depending on what kind of equipment we had on board, and the maximum gross weight was 2,400 pounds. A lot of that weight was radios. We had 3 radios, one UHF for talking to the fighters, a VHF for talking to control towers and some of the other airplanes, and then a VHF FM for talking to the troops on the ground. And all of these radios were big tube-type clunky things, you know, box maybe this big. So most of the equipment weight on the airplane was radios. Navigation was pretty rudimentary. We had no TACAN, no VOR, no DME, had a rudimentary ADF, but hardly anybody had a low-frequency beacon for us to use. So most of the navigation was strictly VFR pilotage.
Does anybody know what the system, the secret system he's talking about here? He says eyeballs. Anybody know what system is that?
Flight rules.
It's looking at your eyeballs, okay? He had to figure it out by looking at a map in one hand and looking outside with his eyeballs. There was no GPS, no navigation system that you guys even have in your car or your hand, okay? This is flying out.
My high-tech sensor for finding the targets was a pair of 7x50 binoculars.
Binoculars, while you're flying.
So I imagine it could be pretty hard using eyeballs in an SR-71.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't work too well in that.
It's a little different system.
Yeah. Okay, so maximum level speed, 115 miles an hour. Normally we cruise around at about 90 to 100. And the service ceiling was claimed to be 21,300 feet. I think I got up to 15 one day, getting over.
What was your average altitude?
Anywhere from 0 to 1,500.
About when we shoot our rockets. Okay, guys, we shoot out here a rocket
Yeah, we
with
can
1,000
hit you with
feet.
our toy rockets at 1,500 feet.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, personal weapons, 38 revolver and an M16. And I've got a good story about the 38. The day I arrived in Vietnam, I was at Tan Son Nhut Air Base at Saigon. This was in September of '65. Back in those days, the Air Force didn't have any big computer systems for maintaining personnel records and pay records and that sort of thing. So it was all manual processing with a clerk using a typewriter and multiple carbons. So anyway, the end processing took about a day. And at the end of the day, they weren't quite through with me. So the sergeant gave me a slip of paper with an address on it. It says, here's a building we've leased for a temporary BOQ. You can go spend a night there and come back in the morning. I said, well, how do I get there? He said, well, just go out to the main gate and just pick one of the taxis and show him the address and they'll take you there. Okay. So I took my little overnight bag, which had my 38 revolver that you just saw in the picture there. They just issued it to me. In fact, it was still in the heavy-duty foil wrap that had come from the Smith & Wesson factory. Hadn't even been opened yet. Plus a box of ammunition and a shaving kit, and a change of clothes. So I go out and get in a taxi, and it's just about dark by then, and I show the Vietnamese driver the address and says, "Do you know where this is?" No problem. So he gets in the traffic stream, and we leave the base there. And they had told me this temporary BOQ was about 3 miles due east of the base. So we start off heading east, and then he makes a 90-degree turn and starts heading north, just as it's getting dark. Well, this is strange. Maybe there's a detour or something. So we start getting farther and farther out into the boonies there, and the houses change to rice paddies, and then we're getting into jungle. So I asked him 2 or 3 times, "Are you sure this is the right address?" "Oh, no problem." So then I started getting nervous about this time, so I moved to the back seat, to the center of the back seat, so he could see me in the rearview mirror. And I took the foil package out of my bag and ripped it open, took the 38 out and loaded 6 rounds into it. Then I leaned over the front seat and using the gun as a pointer, I said, "Are you sure we're going to this address?" "Oh, so." He would turn around, did a 180, and went about 5 miles back into town and went directly to the BOQ, and he dropped me off, and I made a note of the license number and all that kind of stuff. And next morning when I went back into the base, I went in and told the security police what had happened, and they told me that, well, the Viet Cong are offering bounties for American officers with a bonus for pilots. So I'm sure that's what he was up to. He was taking me out to some Viet Cong detachment out there in the jungle, turned me in for a bounty. But I don't know whatever came of it. I left that later on that day and went on to my first post, which was down in the Delta.
So you weren't even there for a week. You were already almost calculated as a PO.
Oh, about 6 or 7 hours.
That's rough.
Yeah.
Took away his bounty.
Yeah. Okay, and on the picture of the airplane, you notice it said there was no armor for the pilot or the pilot seat. Later on, they did add armor. While I was there, we didn't have any. So to protect ourselves as well as we could, 99% of us took out the seat cushion and replaced it with a folded up flak vest, which actually worked. It stopped a bullet, came up through the bottom of the airplane one time, put a bruise on my rear end, but I didn't draw any blood, so no Purple Heart. Okay, and here's a good personal story I got to tell you. Before I went to Vietnam, I was a flight instructor at Randolph Air Force Base, and before that Moody, and for a couple of years there, I've been teaching foreign students to fly in the T-28, most of them being Vietnamese. One of my better students was a young man named Nguyen Ba Phuc. And because he was a good student, he ended up with a Sky Raider assignment, the A-1. So they did the initial checkout for him with the Navy down at Pensacola, and then he went back to Vietnam. And the U.S. Air Force Air Commandos were doing their in-country training. He was on his very first mission in South Vietnam with an American instructor, and they got shot down by the Viet Cong. Phuc was captured. The American instructor was rescued by a helicopter. They went opposite directions apparently after they bellied the airplane down out in a rice paddy someplace. So anyway, almost exactly a year later, I showed up to be a forward air controller, and I'm at Can Tho, which was 4 Corps headquarters down in the Delta. And I'm getting my briefings by the Corps ALO and Intel people and people like that. And I'm standing out on the veranda in front of the building drinking a Coke between lectures, and this Jeep drives up, a South Vietnamese Army Jeep, driven by a South Vietnamese Army sergeant, and this guy in black pajama was right beside him. Looked like a typical Viet Cong, barefooted and so forth. And he gets out and the two of them start walking up to the building, and it's Phuc. He had just escaped from the Viet Cong after a year. And I was the first guy he saw when they brought him into headquarters. So how's that for a strange coincidence? Anyway, I found out later that the intel people were suspicious that his family had paid a bribe to the Viet Cong to allow him to escape. He apparently came from a pretty wealthy family, because his story, the way he told it, was one day everybody just disappeared, and he looked and his cage was unlocked. So he just got out and ran, of course, and got picked up by the South Vietnamese Army. Well, I spent years when I came back trying to find out whatever happened to him. Did he survive the war? You know, was he killed in combat, whatever? And just about a month ago, I finally found a contact in Los Angeles, former Vietnamese Air Force major, who's very involved with their whole community here in the U.S., and he tracked down Phuc for me. He did survive the war. He escaped at the end and made it to France, and that's where he lives now.
Wow, so he's still alive in France.
Well, as of a couple of years ago, he was still alive.
That's
I
amazing.
haven't been able to find an address for him in France to try to get in touch with.
That's neat.
We're still working on it, though.
That's neat.
Okay, I began my FAC tour as a province FAC, right there where you see that arrow, a place called Roc Ja, which was the province headquarters for Kinjang province, which is right down on the Gulf of Thailand. And we had two FACs there, the guy you saw in the first picture, Ed Lewis and I. And our basic job was to go out and fly over the whole territory every day and look for anything that was different. That's what, usually the way we figured out what the Viet Cong were doing, by, you know, a large gathering of sampans going down a canal, something like that. They didn't have any large-scale battles going on at that time, just occasional Viet Cong raids on isolated outposts and that kind of stuff. But the Viet Cong seemed to have a hotline into our province headquarters, because every time one of the two of us would take our airplane up to Ben Hoa for a 100-hour checkup, it seemed like attacks would break out in opposite ends of the province that night simultaneously. So you'd be trying to fly back and forth, provide air support for both of them, which is kind of tough. Our runway was a blocked off street at the edge of town. We had no control tower, nothing like that. And we would come in and buzz the field before landing to get the police to stop the traffic. Across the road that went right across the middle of our runway was the main road into town.
Did you ever have any close calls landing on that runway?
No.
No.
Okay, next picture. Here's our security at the airfield. We had a total of about maybe 20 Americans there in Roc Ja. 2 forward air controllers, we had an Air Force radio operator, and we had our crew chief. The Army had a detachment of advisors there, with a lieutenant colonel in charge. He was a senior ranking American officer there. Then there were several Navy ensigns and Lieutenant JGs who operated out of there as advisors on coastal patrol craft with the South Vietnamese Navy. But we had to depend on the South Vietnamese for most of our support there. Here is our parking ramp. We normally had 4 O1s there, unless we were out flying. We had 1 South Vietnamese Air Force, 1 U.S. Army, and 2 U.S. Air Force. The main road into town goes right across there. You can see the gate for the entrance to town. And we, like I said, we did for a while fly with 1 of these rocket pods on each wing, which gave us a total of 14 rockets instead of 4. And that worked pretty well. You've probably, if you've studied Vietnam at all, you've probably seen pictures of these classic triangle forts that dated from back in the French colonial days. This picture I took here, the one on the left had been abandoned for some reason, and they were building a new one to the right there, right on the canal. The canals were the main means of transport down in this part of Vietnam. Okay, I was there for only 3 months, and then I got a message saying they wanted me to report up to Benoit for briefings. Benoit was an airfield just outside of Saigon. And I was going to a temporary assignment for 90 days up at the north end of Vietnam. Well, as I mentioned in this slide here, the 90-day TDY turned into a permanent change after I got there. But I realized it was going to be a little bit more serious when they issued me a steel helmet and another flak jacket, a mess kit, and so forth. The next day I had to get my 01 in flight all the way to Da Nang from Benoit. It was only 450 miles, but it took 8.5 hours to get there because I was fighting a 50-knot headwind all the way. Okay, and then I get involved in this Operation Tiger Hound, which had just started up at the end of December of '65. At that time, the General Westmoreland convinced the people back in Washington and PACAF headquarters and so forth that he should be in charge of the interdiction against the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the southern part of it. So this new operation split off from Operation Steel Tiger, and they gave it a name of Tiger Hound.
You want to explain to them what interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail would be?
Okay, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the name that the U.S. gave to the system of roads that the North Vietnamese established down through Laos to transport people and supplies into Vietnam, South Vietnam. Technically, Laos was supposed to be neutral territory, but because the North Vietnamese were ignoring that, and the U.S. did too, at this whole time I was there, the fact that we were bombing in Laos was considered top secret. It was not admitted publicly back in the U.S. In fact, our rules of engagement were top secret. But here was the area I'm talking about, right here. This is Laos in the white, the green, North Vietnam. DMZ is right here, and this is South Vietnam. And this is Laos, Cambodia here. This area in the blue was the Tiger Hound area. And I went, after I got to Da Nang, to the squadron headquarters, they sent me on to Dong Ha, which is right here on the DMZ. There's another base here, Khe Sanh, you probably heard about. There was a famous Marine Corps battle at Khe Sanh after I was there. The facts that Dong Ha and Khe Sanh were sharing responsibility for this area here, which went all the way up to an area. One of the main routes into Laos from North Vietnam was through Mugia Pass. And we had the area all the way from A Shao up to Mugia. The two units at Dong Ha and Khe Sanh did that. Okay, our headquarters for our squadron was at Da Nang. We had 4 detachments for Tiger Hound. Khe Sanh, Dong Ha, Kon Tum, and Kiem Duc. Normally about 5 FACs at each detachment. And like I said, Khe Sanh and Dong Ha shared the responsibility of the northernmost part of it. Because it was a classified operation and because it was so restricted, all of the pre-planned strikes into Laos had to be approved by the U.S. ambassador in Vientiane, Laos. Sometimes even in Washington if it was a especially sensitive area. Weather was a big problem for us when we first started this operation because, as I mentioned earlier, the 01 didn't have any real navigation equipment. And it was the rainy season in South Vietnam, especially the northern part. Frequently we'd have 400 or 500 foot ceilings at Dong Ha, but the weather would be clear on the other side of the mountains over in Laos. So they would spot truck convoys coming down the road from North Vietnam, and they wanted forward air controllers. And we would take off, spiral up through the clouds, break out on top, and head west to Laos, and hope that we could figure out a way to get back. let me explain this map here. Because we didn't have any nav aids, we were using the maps and trying to figure out our location, latitude and longitude for our bomb damage reports and so forth. Or if we didn't clearance to strike a particular target, we had to use latitude and longitude. But when the fighters came in, they wanted to fix from the TACAN. We didn't have a TACAN. So we had to take all of our navigation charts and draw these grids on them so you get a radial and approximate DME from Da Nang. So we would figure out where our position was and look at that on our chart and try to translate that to a TACAN fix and tell the fighters where to find us. Actually, it worked pretty well most of the time. For example, this would be 270 degrees and 10 miles, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, so forth.
Guys, let me explain to you what a TACAN is.
Okay, TACAN stands for Tactical Air Navigation. It's similar to a VOR with the DME. It doesn't
Explain to them what that is. They don't know.
Okay, a VOR, VHF Omni Range is also a, have you ever driven across Outer Loop Road?
Yeah, Outer Loop Road, remember you got the Mexican hat out there, it's a navigational beacon. This is a stoplight or a crossroads in the sky. Okay, so it's a navigation to a crossroads, and then from that you can go out or come in via your navigational system inside the jet that talks to you about the radial and the radial that you're going out, or the distance, the miles. So what they're doing here is try to replicate that, because they did not have that ability in Vietnam, and so that you could say, okay, I'm on the northern heading for 20 miles, or I'm on the southern heading for 20 miles, and that would allow you to talk to other pilots in the sky and figure out where you are.
Yeah, one of our real hot spots in our area was Chapone. Let's see where that is. Yeah, right here. There's various spellings. Most common one was TCHEPONE. But as you can look, this is Dong Ha TACAN here, so it would be approximately 260 at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 260, maybe 262, 60 miles from Dong Ha TACAN. Okay? When we went back to land at Dong Ha, if the weather was still bad, normally with the weather conditions we had, there was a mountain just north of Khe Sanh with a peak at about 5,700 feet. It was normally just peeking up through the clouds there. So we would head to that mountain, take up a heading of 090, fly for so many minutes, let down at 1,000 feet per minute out over here in the water, make a 180, come back into the coast and head north until we found this Ben Hai River here and follow that in at low altitude till we got to the Highway 1 bridge and turn south, and there's Dong Ha Air Base. That's how we navigated. It worked most of the time. Occasionally, if the wind was out of the south and you didn't know about it, you'd end up in North Vietnam, which was not too good. It was easy to tell because as soon as you came out below the clouds, it'd start shooting at you. So you just back up into the clouds and head south for a while. This was our typical weather at that time of the year.
When you're in the clouds without control, you weren't worried about flying into other people?
We just didn't think about it.
Rather lucky than good, right?
Yeah.
Rather lucky than good.
Of course, we had no IFF either.
Yeah. Nobody knew where everybody was. It's the big sky theory. You're just praying you're not running into another plane.
Right. Anyway, here's Dong Ha Air Base. This is the river I was talking about. We'd follow this in from the coast. We hit this bridge and then turn south, and here's the field right here. Gravel runway, about 6,000 feet long. I think.
20. How long did it take you to land the 01?
Oh, 500 to 1,000 feet.
1,000 feet. Okay, 500,000 feet. 2 or 3 football fields.
Our parking area for our 01s was over here. Sandbag revetment set up. And this was our living quarters here. This is our BOQ. Normally had 8 guys per tent. And the guy there was stacking up sandbags for protection against mortar attacks. We eventually ended up with sandbags about head high around the tent, and each guy had sandbags around his cot in the tent. So when the mortar attack started, we could just roll out of our cot, under the cot, until the mortar attack had a lull, and then we'd get up and run for our mortar shelter, which we also built ourselves. The way this was constructed was a pit with the beams across and a layer of this pierced steel planking on top of that with sandbags above that, and then another layer of the pierced steel planking a couple of feet above that. The theory being that if a mortar shell hit this, it would detonate and be absorbed by the sandbags before it could penetrate to the interior. And it would probably work, although we never got a direct hit on one while we were in there. Fortunately for us, the Viet Cong were apparently as scared or more scared than we were, because we'd have mortar attacks 3 or 4 nights a week there at Dong Hai. We were only a few miles from the DMZ, but usually anywhere from a quarter to a third of them would be duds. They'd forget to pull the arming pins or something like it. One night as I was running for the mortar shelter, something hit right between my feet. The next morning we went out and looked, and there was a dud 60 millimeter mortar shell that landed about 6 inches from me.
Should have saved it.
Thank you.
The EOD people took it.
It still is.
This is Quezon Air Base. This was a little bit more primitive. It was closer to Laos. See these 2 white structures here? Those are the roofs over the underground hangars for the O-1s. You had to keep the O-1s in underground hangars and tow them out with a tractor every morning, because if you left them above ground, they'd be full of bullet holes by morning. They were surrounded by hills with snipers and so forth. The people lived in underground bunkers there, about 8 feet underground. And they had rats the size of possums too. But
Rats, the size.
this is the way we operated over there. We normally have a flight of 2 O-1s with one guy flying low, actually looking for fresh tire tracks and looking laterally under the trees for camouflage trucks, with the other guy staying higher altitude, looking over him, warning him of anything on the road up ahead of him, and maintaining radio relay with the airborne control ship or the
I just
fighter.
realized, how do we do this nowadays in Afghanistan, guys?
Just drones.
Drones. He was a drone 50 years ago, right? I mean, seriously, this is 45 years ago. He was a drone.
Yeah.
Now they have drones flown out of Las Vegas over Afghanistan, doing what? Looking for fresh tire tracks, looking for convoys, and then engaging and wiping out the bad guys.
It
Of
was
course,
just-
the drones are not at 1,500 feet. The drones are at 10,000, 15,000 feet.
Yeah,
They have
well-
awesome, video cameras.
Actually, the low guy usually flew, almost skimming the road, 10 or 20 feet, because you had to
10
get
or
down,
20 feet.
looking sideways into the trees where they hit all the trucks. They do most of the truck convoys would do most of their traveling at night, or almost all of it, and then hide them under the trees and camouflage them during the day. That's what we were looking for. The strange thing about it was the low guy hardly ever got hit by ground fire.
Could have rolled down your.
The guy's sitting there in his truck, and all of a sudden he sees a plane right there, 10 feet away.
I actually had a guy, a North Vietnamese soldier, step out of the bushes and empty a whole magazine from an AK-47 as I went by. Didn't even hit the airplane.
Could have rolled down your window and shot him out with your 38.
Didn't have time for that. I was just ducking.
Shoot one of your smoke rockets at him.
But one strange event was one day I apparently scared this tiger, not this tiger, but a tiger.
Pretty good picture.
Yeah. Startled a tiger, which was in the bushes to the side of the road, and he leaped across the road right in front of me. And it was almost a midair with a tiger, which would have been hard to explain. It wasn't really that close. It startled me, and I pulled up a little bit to keep from hitting him. But probably the only tiger I'll ever chance to see in the wild. Okay, I mentioned that Chapone was the hot spot. You can see all the bomb craters and everything. It was a major hub for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. there were, you know what karst is? Big limestone outcroppings. Probably seen pictures of them from China and places like it. Well, anyway, it's very porous and relatively soft for rock. So the North Vietnamese, and before them the Viet Minh, had built all this system of tunnels and caves in these karst ridges there close to Chipone. Some of them were actually big enough that they could drive a convoy of 200 trucks inside and it would just disappear. But anyway, this was one of their major hubs. And constant bombing. You can see where they built underwater boards here that just dump gravel in so they could drive across without getting stuck. And
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not one road. It was a
whole system
It
of
was a
roads.
rope of roads,
Yeah.
and that was the problem. Is that as soon as you take down one bridge, they keep going the other way.
Yeah. Okay. Next. This is an actual official bomb damage assessment photo. It's very easy to see the the underwater ford right here. If you look on Google Earth right now, you can find this easy enough. It's on Highway 9 that goes west from Dong Ha through Khe Sanh.
Have you been back to Vietnam?
No. Well, not on the ground. If you look at it now, you can see that the bridge has been rebuilt, the highway's been rebuilt, and all these bypass roads are now just city streets. Okay, I was only there for a week before this happened, right over Chipone, and all of a sudden about 16 anti-aircraft guns opened up. I was about 1,500 feet at the time. And one of them got a direct hit on the right wing, just blew about the last 4 feet of the wing off.
Want to explain who Hanoi Hannah is?
Yeah. Maybe you heard of Tokyo Rose in World War II. Well, anyway, Hanoi Hannah was a radio broadcaster in North Vietnam who made propaganda broadcasts every day trying to convince the U.S. soldiers to desert or kill their officers or whatever, and giving her a view of the news of what was going on in South Vietnam. Pretty accurate most of the time. But anyway, the next day after this happened, on her broadcast, she claimed that they had shot me down and killed me. Of course, she didn't use my name. She didn't know my name, but she used my call sign, which was Hound Dog 64. Obviously, they didn't, but they probably found a big enough piece of the airplane that they could claim they shot it down. This is what a typical native village looked like in that area of Laos. And it seemed that as long as they were far enough away from the road system, the North Vietnamese left them alone. I never did figure out what these were. I saw several of them. It's on a tree where the top has been cut out of it, and there's this structure built up in there like a tree house or some kind of shrine or something. I never saw any activity around any of them, but they were scattered all over the place there.
Maybe there are secret North Vietnamese takans.
Yeah. See this area right here? This is a fairly steep hillside. 4 Navy A-1s came in one day after they'd been diverted from their primary target in North Vietnam because of weather. They each had two 2,000-pound bombs with delay fuses on it. And we've been looking for something to cut this road. And that was the perfect thing. So I directed them in right here. One of them put his first bomb right on the road, and the next guy says, "Well, where do you want mine?" I said, "Just make the hole bigger." And that's what they did. They completely caved down this hillside. It just slid off into the gully there. And for the next week, by keeping 24-hour air cover over this, we managed to back up several convoys and actually destroyed more than 200 trucks full of supplies backed up behind it. And then a couple of days bad weather set in. We couldn't keep 24-hour air cover over it anymore. And the North Vietnamese combat engineers came in and fixed this road in one night. That's how good it was.
One night. Wow.
I mentioned earlier, General Westmoreland was a commander. He came up and visited one day. That's him with his hand out there. Dong Ha was so isolated and so dangerous that it was hard to get any of the USO people up there. But Robert Mitchum was the only one brave enough to come up and visit while I was there. He spent a whole afternoon with us.
Robert Mitchum is a famous actor at the time.
Yeah.
Think Justin Timberlake. Okay.
Except, well, he was more of a macho type character, though. But yeah, he came up and spent a whole afternoon with us. So just to summarize what happened with Tiger Hound, it officially operated from 5 December 65 to 11 November 68. Then it was absorbed as a part of another operation. But while Tiger Hound was operating, flew 103,000 tactical air sorties over Laos. This is the bombers, tankers, well, not tankers so much, bombers, fighters, forward air controllers, and so forth. We lost 132 U.S. aircraft during that period in that area. And we destroyed thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of tons of supplies. But later on, intelligence calculated that in 1966 alone, the North Vietnamese infiltrated about 90,000 men along that route and completed a system of 2,959 kilometers of vehicle-capable roads, including 275 kilometers of main roads. They were also transporting and storing the supplies for the famous Tet Offensive, which happened in 1968. And this last paragraph is my own personal opinion, but I'm sure it's shared by a lot of people. Our failure to stop the transport of all this stuff down the Ho Chi Minh Trail was due to the policy dictated by Defense Secretary McNamara and President Johnson.
You want to explain to them what they did in your opinion?
In my opinion, by restricting bombing of the ports in Haiphong and the railroad that came down from China, they made it possible for the North Vietnamese to get all their supplies loaded onto trucks and headed down the trail. So it turned into a big game, trying to hunt them down one at a time or one convoy at a time. And again, my personal opinion, that flawed policy led to the loss of too many good people.
What happened, guys, was in that war, there was a philosophy that, again, not military people dictated the war. The politicians who did not have military experience or command experience dictated the war. And so consequently, the fighter pilots, the warriors, were not given free rein to go win the war. Which, things have changed. We now have joint chiefs of staff. And ideally, the Congress says, yes, we're declaring war, here's your objective, and the military goes out and prosecutes the war without day-to-day interference by the president or the Secretary of Defense, the civilian authority. So that's the theory now.
Yeah, well, during Vietnam, and like he's talking about the ideal situation from a military standpoint. There's still a lot of direction from Washington, nitpicking details. But in Vietnam, it was so bad that if we found a SAM site threatening us and the fighters, we could not attack it unless it fired at us first, unless we got clearance from Washington. Which means by the time we got the clearance from Washington, it already moved on to a new site and you had to start all over again. Okay. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Did the Ravens, the specific flight group of O1s, I believe, did they have the same missions as
Yeah, they were operating from the opposite side, from Thailand coming over, and some of them are actually based in Laos in secret bases.
Did you ever know what Fred Platt?
I've heard the name, I think, but I don't know him, no. Yeah, they were actually masquerading as civilians, flying in, jeans and cowboy boots or whatever. No U.S. military uniforms. So.
You want to give a quick synopsis of where you were sitting in high school and how you got to Vietnam?
I went to high school in a small town in Arkansas named Fordyce. We have one famous export, Bear Bryant, former coach at Alabama. You heard of him? He and my mother were classmates in high school. Anyway, then I got a Navy ROTC scholarship when I graduated from high school. And I went to the University of New Mexico on this Navy ROTC scholarship. But after a midshipman cruise on an aircraft carrier, I decided that flying looked like great fun, but I didn't want any part of living on a boat. So I dropped out of Navy ROTC and joined the Air Force as an aviation cadet. There is no aviation cadet program anymore. At that time, if you could pass the entrance exam, they call it the AFOQT, they still use that, don't you?
Yes, sir, exactly.
Yeah, if you could pass that and a physical, you could become an aviation cadet, which was a 15-month program, combination officer training and pilot training. And if you made it through that, you could get your wings and commission as a second lieutenant at the same time. And that's what I did. Of course, you don't have that option anymore now. You got to be an officer to go to pilot training. So don't do it the way I did, which was the hard way.
Do you have any advice to give to high schoolers of things you did right or things you might not have done right?
I would say if you want to be an officer in the military, Air Force, or any other service, get all the math, science, and history you can while you're in high school. And I got some bad advice when I was at the University of New Mexico. I started off to be an aeronautical engineer. And a physics professor told me, after I told him that my ambition was to be a test pilot and then an astronaut, he says, "You're dreaming. You'll never be able to be an astronaut." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because," and he explained all these technical reasons why they would never build spacecraft big enough for a guy my height to get into, because it just took too much extra fuel to make the spacecraft that much bigger. So he convinced me that my dream was hopeless. So I said, why go through all this trouble to be an engineer if it's not going to get me to where I want to be? So I switched to business. In hindsight, I would have been better off to stay in engineering. But anyway, so learn all you can while you can, and do the best you can in every class. Try to get the best grades you can, because especially if you want to be a pilot in the Air Force, with the big emphasis on drones now, they're going to take only the best. There's not going to be that many pilot opportunities. It's going to be very competitive. Well, it was competitive even when I was going through aviation cadet training. We started with 420 in my class, which was 61F. 98 of us graduated. And I think part of that was the reason was because they had already started phasing out the aviation cadet program at that time. The Air Force decided they wanted nothing but college graduates as officers. So they made it as hard as they could while we were going. I was in the next to the last class. I was in 61F. 61G was the very last aviation cadet class.
So did you finish your degree later?
Yeah, later by going to night school and weekends, I got to finish my bachelor's degree and got a master's degree.
Right.
But I realized early on that to get past major, I was going to have at least a bachelor's degree.
Sure.
And then after you're done with the military, you flew for Alaskan Air?
Yeah, when I first retired from the Air Force, the major airlines had not really started hiring older guys at that point. This was pretty soon after deregulation. So I got a job with an airline called Sun World, which is based in Las Vegas, flying DC-9. They started up about the same time America West did. and they were direct competitors. But unfortunately for Sunworld, America West had deeper pockets and they outlasted us. So when Sunworld went out of business, then I got hired by Alaska Airlines in January of '89 and stayed with them a little over 10 years before I had to retire at age 60. Any other questions?
How long did you actually spend in Vietnam doing the forward air control?
I was there just about 11 months because the Air Force was giving you a month off your 12-month tour for every 10 missions over Vietnam, over North Vietnam. And about a month before I came home, we actually started flying missions into the southern part of North Vietnam. So I was 12 or 13 missions, so they lopped a month off my tour for that. But then at the same time we started doing that, North Vietnamese started moving heavier anti-aircraft defenses down to that part of North Vietnam.
Right.
And my replacement at Dong Ha only lasted about a month before he was blown out of the sky by an SA-2. They were probably shooting at one of the fighters and hit him by mistake, because normally they wouldn't waste an SA-2 on an O-1.
Right.
We have a picture here of SR-71. Can you tell us how you transitioned from Vietnam to fighters to SR-71?
Yeah, well, a lot of people think that's strange that I flew O-1s and SR-71s, but I flew F-102s and F-106s for about 6.5 years in between. And actually, a lot of guys had trouble checking out in the SR-71 because of the air refueling. Because there was if you look at the picture there,
Right.
well, you can see over there, the canopy came to a peak in the front. There was a bar right down the middle of it, so you had to learn how to look around that thing to refuel. But it was almost the identical picture to refueling in the F-106, which I was used to, so it was fairly simple for me.
Here's the F-106 picture, I think.
Yeah, the one on, those are F-106s. F-106 was a neat airplane, actually. It would do Mach 2 easy, and it had great range. In fact, I flew nonstop one day, unrefueled, from Payne Field, Washington, which is just north of Seattle, to Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida,
Unrefueled.
unrefueled.
Wow. What altitude? 40s?
It's between 35 and 40.
That's great.
But you see those streamlined drop tanks under the wings? Those were so streamlined that when they were empty, you could go Mach 2 with the tanks on.
Mach 2 with the tanks on. That's amazing. I did not know that.
Yeah. And it cruised at about 0.93 Mach. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Denny, but the F-106 cruised at about 0.93 Mach on an average of about 3,500 pounds per hour. Whereas I think the F-4 cruised at about 0.84 Mach on about 6,000 pounds an hour.
Exactly. You're exactly well. It's 2 engines versus 1, right? The same concept.
So when I first started flying the F-106, we had the primary air defense commitment in Alaska, although we didn't have F-106s permanently based up there. So every F-106 squadron down in the lower 48 would have a 3-month period of alert duty in Alaska.
We have about 2 minutes, okay? Any last questions, guys, before we stop this session?
To finish this, so the Alaskan Air Command wanted a first-line fighter permanently based up there, so they finally got their wish, and the Air Force gave them a squadron of F-4Es. Then they found out they didn't have the range or endurance that the F-106 did, so they had to put a tanker on alert for the F-4s. So anytime they'd launch F-4s out of, say, Galena or King Salmon or something to go up to the northern part, around Barrow, they'd launch a tanker for them at the same time to refuel them on the way back.
That's true. That's true. That's kind of unusual. All right, everybody, give a round of applause, please.